Welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to conduct a rigorous academic analysis of Hüseyin Batuhan's philosophical text regarding the fundamental nature of ethical propositions.
Right, and we are going to bypass all introductory preamble to directly examine his central premise, which is how language systematically disguises our subjective values as objective truths.
Exactly. And to dismantle this linguistic architecture, Batuhan asks us to participate in a foundational thought experiment involving three specific propositions.
Yes, three statements that, grammatically speaking, appear identical in their structure. The first proposition is the interior angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees.
Right. And the second is that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level.
And the final proposition is simply lying is bad.
Now, the analytical trap here lies in their grammatical uniformity, doesn't it?
Precisely. Batuhan argues that we must temporarily ignore their syntax and, well, meticulously analyze the epistemological nature of each statement.
I mean, the first proposition regarding the triangle clearly belongs to the realm of analytical mathematical knowledge.
Yes, it is entirely deductive. Its validity doesn't depend on our observation of the physical world at all. It's verified purely by logical demonstration based on a set of accepted axioms.
Which means it tells us absolutely nothing about external physical reality.
Right. Whereas the second proposition, the one concerning boiling water, operates on an entirely different epistemological plane.
It is empirical and inductive, right? Because it relies directly on observation, experimentation, and, measurement within the physical world.
Exactly. Unlike the absolute certainty of mathematical deduction, empirical statements offer what we might call approximate or probable truth, a truth which must be continuously verified through physical testing.
Which then forces us to rigorously categorize the third proposition, lying is bad. The text asks whether this statement belongs to the deductive category of mathematics or the empirical category of physics.
And structurally, it's quite evident that it does not function mathematically. I mean, we cannot deduce badness from geometric axioms.
So the natural inclination is to categorize it as an empirical statement. When you process it, lying is bad looks linguistically identical to a factual physical description like, this table is made of walnut.
It does. However, if we apply strict analytical interrogation, a profound divergence emerges there.
Right, because we can empirically test the wood of a table to verify its cellular composition, but what empirical instrument measures badness?
There isn't one.
I mean, can we physically observe or test the moral weight of a lie?
We cannot. And this precise lack of empirical verifiability exposes the linguistic illusion Batuhan is targeting here.
So for an empirical proposition to hold validity, it must describe a verifiable event or condition in the physical world.
Yes, and the statement lying is bad achieves neither of those things. Consequently, it cannot be categorized as empirically true or empirically false. It exists entirely outside the binary of truth values.
Well, if we logically establish that ethical statements can neither be empirically observed nor mathematically deduced, our analysis really has to pivot here.
Right, we have to identify what their actual structural function is.
If lying is bad is not a factual statement, what is it? Batuhan concludes that it is actually a disguised command.
Precisely. The text categorizes it as an imperative hiding in indicative clothing. It's true, underlying form is simply the directive, do not lie.
And Batuhan notes a crucial linguistic principle regarding this, which is that an imperative possesses no truth value.
Exactly. It cannot be deemed right or wrong in a theoretical sense.
Right.
I mean, consider the direct command, open the door. That utterance is neither true nor false. It is merely an expression of human will or desire.
This raises a really critical question about societal mechanics for me. Why does human society purposefully disguise these commands?
That is the core issue.
I mean, if the goal is simply to prevent lying, why not exclusively use the imperative mood?
Well, the text suggests it is an attempt to grant subjective behavioral directives an authoritative objective appearance.
So it essentially attempts to elevate social rules to the unalterable status of the laws of physics.
Right. Interestingly, though, Batuhan observes that historical religious texts frequently dispense with this grammatical disguise entirely.
Oh, yes, they present raw, undisguised moral imperatives, such as thou shalt not kill, without really attempting to mask them as factual propositions.
And to clarify the societal utility of these disguised imperatives, Batuhan introduces an exceptionally clear comparison, traffic signs.
Traffic signs, right?
Yes, the ethical norm, lying, is bad functions identically to a do not pass or a narrow road sign on a highway. They are practical, utilitarian rules designed strictly to regulate social behavior.
To prevent systemic collisions, essentially.
Precisely. They are entirely devoid of objective theoretical truth. Saying lying is bad is functionally synonymous with saying do not cross when the light is red.
Because the underlying meaning of both is identical. If you engage in this specific behavior, the collective society will penalize you. I want to introduce a quick analogy here to test the boundaries of this framework. If we consider the architecture of a building, verifying a factual statement is akin to testing the load-bearing capacity of a steel beam, right? We can empirically prove whether it holds the weight.
Yes, I follow.
But what Batuhan is suggesting is that an ethical statement is more like debating the aesthetic style of the building's facade. You cannot use a mathematical stress test to prove that Art Deco is truer than brutalism.
That is a very apt comparison. You can only justify it by appealing to human preference.
And this distinction leads to a significant epistemological problem. If we cannot verify ethical statements, like we verify the strength of a steel beam, how does a society legitimately evaluate them?
Well, the text addresses this exact dilemma by establishing a strict academic distinction between verification and justification.
Okay, so verification, as we noted, applies exclusively to factual, empirical propositions.
Yes. Justification, conversely, is the mechanism we apply to imperatives and norms. Because it is logically impossible to verify a command, we justify it by attaching it to collective desires and practical outcomes.
So we justify the command, do not lie, by appending a societal rationale, like, because if you lie, interpersonal trust will collapse and the social order will disintegrate.
Precisely. Within this analytical framework, the concepts of good and bad undergo a radical transformation. They are stripped entirely of their absolute, universal, or divine connotations.
So good is redefined simply as a designation for an action that is desired and approved by a specific society.
Right, which subsequently leads to social praise or reward. And bad denotes an action that is undesired by that collective, leading to blame or punitive measures.
To demonstrate this linguistic nuance, Batuhan meticulously breaks down our everyday usage of the word good. He demands we differentiate between its descriptive and evaluative functions.
Yes, he offers the example of a descriptive good, such as stating the Olover-Bursa Road is a good road.
And in this specific context, good does not reflect a moral stance at all.
No, it acts as a stenographic shorthand summarizing objective, verifiable physical traits. I mean, it just means the road is wide, the asphalt is smooth, and the route is direct.
But let us contrast that with an evaluative use of the word. Consider the statement, Ahmet is a good person.
Right.
Analyzing this statement academically, we have to recognize it as a hybrid proposition. It deliberately amalgamates objective descriptive elements with the speaker's subjective reaction.
Yes, so the empirically observable facts, for instance, that Ahmet assists his neighbors, tells the truth, works diligently, those are objective.
But it mixes those with the purely subjective emotional reaction to Ahmet's behavior. The objective actions can be verified, but the goodness remains a subjective emotional overlay applied by the observer.
Exactly. The objective actions exist independently, but the evaluation of good requires a human mind expressing preference.
And having established that ethical evaluations are rooted in subjective emotional reactions rather than objective universal facts, Batuhan turns his critique toward the very concept of ethics operating as a normative science.
He views this terminology as a fundamental contradiction in terms, a contradictio in effecto.
The contradiction is deeply embedded in the definitions themselves, isn't it? Science, derived from the classical concept of theoria, is dedicated exclusively to the observation and description of what is.
Right, whereas norms, by their very definition, dictate what ought to be.
It seems analogous to attempting to invent aesthetic physics, like trying to use a thermometer to mathematically measure the beauty of a Renaissance painting. It applies the tools of objective measurement to a realm of subjective valuation.
Batuhan actually employs a highly effective sports analogy to illuminate this unbridgeable divide. Science represents the neutral spectator observing the factual events of a football match.
So the spectator notes the verifiable theoretical fact, Galatasaray beat Fener 3-1.
Yes. Ethics, conversely, represents the players on the field or the partisan fans in the stands screaming in frustration. They shouldn't have won.
I see. The fans are expressing a practical desire, a subjective emotional reaction. They are not articulating a theoretical fact.
Exactly. Because the outcome of the match remains an unalterable historical fact, regardless of the depth of the fan's emotional disapproval.
He illustrates this further with the historical event of Julius Caesar's assassination. The statement Brutus killed Caesar is an objective, verifiable historical fact.
Right. However, the statement Brutus shouldn't have killed Caesar is a subjective value judgment.
It reflects the speaker's political and emotional stance regarding the assassination, not an inherent, measurable property of the event itself.
Precisely. I mean, a Roman citizen with opposing political allegiances could observe the exact same historical fact and state, Brutus's action was glorious.
And connecting this to the broader philosophical tradition, the text asserts that claiming something is morally good because it is objectively true is an epistemological impossibility.
Yes, good and true cannot simultaneously act as predicates for the same subject in this manner. Truth belongs unequivocally to the realm of what is, while goodness belongs exclusively to the realm of what is desired.
This unyielding division between theory and practice explains a major, observable phenomenon in human society, one that directly impacts you, the listener, anytime you observe a debate.
You're referring to the nature and duration of our disagreements.
Yes, the text compels us to contrast the mechanics of scientific disputes with ethical ones.
Well, in the scientific realm, a dispute over a factual matter operates with a built-in termination point. For instance, an argument over the exact geographical coordinates of a city ends the precise moment empirical data is presented.
Because theoretical disagreements usually stem from a mere deficit of information. Once the missing data is supplied, the dispute organically dissolves.
Ethical disputes, however, follow a completely divergent trajectory. Debates over complex societal structures such as the ethics of capital punishment or monogamy versus polygamy.
Or democracy versus communism.
Right. These can theoretically persist for centuries without resolution.
But I must inject a challenge here. If we accept Batuhan's premise that these values are merely subjective conventions, does this framework logically force us into absolute moral relativism?
That is a critical question.
I mean, does it mean a society that deeply desires a practice we find abhorrent is functionally acting out its own good, rendering us unable to objectively criticize them?
That is the precise intellectual friction Batuhan's text generates. From his academic standpoint, yes, the foundational premises of different societies cannot be scientifically proven or disproven against one another.
Because you cannot definitively solve a moral debate across cultures in the way you solve a mathematical equation.
Right. There is no universal axiom to appeal to. When you criticize another culture's practices, you are not stating a scientific fact. You are clashing your subjective value system against theirs.
Therefore, the only recourse in ethical disputes, whether interpersonal or international, is the utilization of logic, rhetoric, and sometimes leverage to reach a social consensus.
You must persuade the opposing party to voluntarily adopt your subjective premise. The ultimate goal in the realm of ethics is compromise, rather than the revelation of an absolute mathematical truth.
If moral objectivity is indeed a linguistic illusion, the discussion must confront a profound historical reality. Why did the most prominent figures in Western philosophy dedicate their lives to attempting to prove the exact opposite?
And this inquiry brings us to Batuhan's rigorous critique of Socrates and Plato.
The author details how Socrates essentially misapplied epistemological tools, didn't he?
He did. He treated subjective ethical conventions, concepts like courage, justice, and virtue, which the Greeks categorized as doxa, meaning opinion or belief, as if they were objective, unalterable mathematical concepts.
Socrates operated under the assumption that a concept like courage existed independently in the universe, waiting to be definitively defined, much like the geometric definition of a triangle.
Yes, but because ethical norms are inherently conventions and opinions rather than objective truths, Socrates' lifelong method of dialectical questioning was guaranteed to end in aporia, or unresolved failure.
He could never locate the ultimate objective definition of virtue because it simply did not exist outside of human convention.
However, Batuhan carefully notes that Socrates maintained intellectual humility. He acknowledged his own lack of ultimate knowledge, even if he failed to recognize that his foundational methodology for seeking it was flawed.
We must then contrast Socrates' epistemological humility with the approach of his student, Plato. Where Socrates maintained rigorous doubt, Plato replaced it with dogmatic certainty.
Right. Plato claimed to have transcended doxa entirely, asserting he had discovered the absolute hierarchical truth of the universe, culminating in what he termed the good.
And upon this supposedly absolute unassailable truth, he designed his vision of the ideal state,
Which Batuhan subjects to a severe academic deconstruction. He argues that Plato did not discover universal truth. Rather, he merely took his own aristocratic prejudices, his personal doxa, and disguised them as absolute reality.
So, by elevating his subjective political preferences to the status of objective mathematical truth, Plato constructed a philosophical system that structurally prohibited debate or compromise,
Yeah.
which introduces one of the most conceptually disruptive historical ironies highlighted in the text. Because Plato explicitly equated his subjective values with absolute objective truth, the implications for dissent were lethal.
Exactly. In Plato's ideal state, a citizen who disagreed with the ruling ideology wasn't merely incorrect in a theoretical academic sense. They were fundamentally categorized as morally evil and rationally defective.
Therefore, they had to be physically eliminated for the preservation of the state's supposed purity.
The most striking logical conclusion Batuhan draws from this analysis is a hypothetical historical scenario. If Socrates, with his relentless methodology of questioning foundational assumptions, were to walk into his own student's ideal state, he would be immediately executed.
The philosopher who championed the perpetual search for truth would be killed as a dangerous subversive by a totalitarian state that claimed to have already monopolized it.
It is a profound irony, and this historical and philosophical critique is not relegated to antiquity. The text ultimately directs this analysis toward its most vital practical application, the structural foundations of modern political ideologies.
So the theoretical becomes deeply political. Batuhan presents a final, definitive thesis regarding governance.
Yes. He argues that since there are no absolute objective truths to be found in the realms of ethics or politics, any political system that explicitly claims to possess absolute truth inevitably descends into totalitarianism.
The text points to historical examples like various implementations of communism or the theoretical model of Plato's ideal state.
And to maintain our strict academic impartiality, we are solely reporting the author's deductive reasoning here. Because the truth these totalitarian systems claim to hold cannot be proven objectively or verified empirically, they cannot rely on organic, natural consensus among the governed.
Therefore, to maintain their rigid structures and enforce their unprovable ethical premises, these systems must systematically rely on ideological indoctrination, continuous propaganda, and the application of physical force.
Right. Batuhan starkly contrasts these totalitarian models with the ideological framework of democracy. He posits that democracy is unique because it is a system that fundamentally recognizes its own epistemological limitations.
It acknowledges at its core that its governing rules and laws are not divine decrees or absolute theoretical truths, but rather a set of flexible human conventions continuously negotiated by its citizens.
And because it recognizes the inherent relativity of its own foundations, democracy places its highest structural value on freedom.
Specifically, it protects the freedom for humans to consciously choose, to debate openly without fear of execution, and to mutually agree upon the subjective conventions that will govern their shared societal lives.
It is a system built on the pragmatic acceptance of doxa, purposefully rejecting the dangerous authoritarian illusion of absolute moral truth.
To summarize this rigorous intellectual journey, we have transitioned from deconstructing the grammatical disguise of a simple sentence like lying is bad, revealing it to be a mere behavioral imperative.
We then traced how the epistemological error of treating these subjective imperatives as objective truths historically paved the way for Plato's authoritarianism.
Finally, we arrived at the profound realization that acknowledging the subjective, negotiated nature of our values is not a weakness, but rather the very prerequisite for democratic freedom.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a final, necessary analytical inquiry to consider.
If we accept Batuhan's rigorous premise that all moral and political rules are merely subjective social conventions, and we recognize that we now inhabit a hyper-connected global society where drastically different conventions collide continuously, how do we architect a shared traffic system of morality without defaulting to the rigid authoritarianism of Plato's ideal state?
A vital question for further reflection.
That concludes our deep dive into the text.